Welcome back to the channel. This is the usual weekly vintage collection market update, and as you can tell by this thumbnail, it's the first time I think I've ever seen a loose graded vintage collection pre-production prototype. For whatever that's worth. It just happens to be the Jar Jar Binks in Carbonite from the Lost Line set. And it was a CAS graded prototype that sold at auction. So we'll dig into that towards the end of the video, but I've got lots of different data points for the vintage collection for this week. I hope you enjoy the content. If you do, don't forget to leave me a like, as it does help out with the channel. So let's take a look at some sales. And the first interesting one that I found was a foil VC08 Darth Vader. And it's just the US release foil example. It was listed for $175, and that seemed kind of high to me, but I did check out the 130point.com best offer accepted tool, and the best offer accepted was $149. $149 was the sale on that. I can't remember the last time we've talked about this particular card back figure combo. I feel like it was in that 100 to 125 range, but my memory is not that great sometimes. But that one did sell at $149. It did look pretty clean overall, but it sold. Next up was an interesting lot. I thought this was a pretty good deal for what it was. We had an unpunched Wedge Antilles with the Darth Maul offer. We had a punched Dak Ralter with the prototype VCPO3 rocket firing Boba Fett mail away offer. And then we had a punched dark blue lightsaber Luke Dagobah Landing, VC44, my favorite character, or card back anyway, from the vintage collection, or one of them. But I thought that this was a pretty good deal for $127 plus $7 shipping. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that VC44, even punched, would sell for around that number. But prices definitely have come down for certain TVC. And that one is one of them. And as we talked about, there is a dark blue and light blue lightsaber variation, but that one is the dark blue. So $127 for those three plus shipping. And then Power Droid had a number of interesting sales. And my question to you guys is, let's say you are a huge vintage collection fan. Do you go through and start collecting every variation for every card back, like Only One Kenobi, Nick? You know, getting the offerless and the offer, or if there's multiple offers, do you get the US release and the Canadian release and the Euro release with the warning labels? I'm just curious as to how far down the rabbit hole you guys go. It's just an interesting thought process that, I've certainly done it with vintage Kenner items, certain card back and character runs that you can do. Obviously, Jeff Jacob is the king of that. He's got pretty much every character and card back combination there is. But this is kind of a different phenomenon that I'm not sure if vintage collection collectors really do, just because there's so many of them. I mean, we're in the 400s now. I don't even know the number. It's up there. And I'm just curious as to how many of you guys actually try to collect every variation, or do you do it casually, just based on money and time. But I would think it's really more of a space issue, because these are all fairly affordable, most of them. And to get every Darth Vader out there, it wouldn't be that expensive in the grand scheme of things. But this one was the Canadian VC08 ESB Darth Vader offerless. And that one sold for $70. And he had a number of other beautiful Canadian examples. This one I thought was interesting, the VC09 offerless Canadian Boba Fett. Usually this is the one we know of that has the Boba Fett error with the misspelling on the Boba Fett offer sticker. And I don't know if we've talked about a offerless Canadian before or not, but this is one that was listed by Power Droid as well, and that sold at $100. And then we had speaking of that Boba Fett error, here it is. You can see how it's misspelled there. And these are not that difficult to find, but they're sought after by collectors just as a cool variation. So this is the Canadian Boba Fett error AT-AT Commander, and that one was listed for $75, and the best offer accepted on that was $65. So some of those are relatively inexpensive to find for that error. But you know, once you start going down the rabbit hole with offer list versus offer, you know, having the offers, and then you can also get the corrected version, right? So I don't know if they made corrected versions for all of the figures. I certainly have seen some of them, but you could, in theory, have an offer list, one with the error, and then one with the corrected offer. So that's just for the Canadian. And then you'd have the US release and the European. You could have 5 or more that I can think of off the top of my head for certain TVC. He also had the Panda Baba. That one has definitely come back down to earth just a little bit, obviously, with the, I wouldn't call them a reissue since it is slightly different paint apps and things like that, but it's close. But this Panda Baba sold for $100, obviously the original issue with the prototype FET offer. And then Power Droid had another Revenge of the Jedi SDCC version of VC64 Slave Leia. And that one again sold for $300. I believe that's the second or third one he's had, but that is obviously a very desirable one among collectors. And we had another Imperial Assault Tank Commander. This is going back to the video last week where a buddy of mine had a UKG 90 grade for this particular character, the Imperial Assault Tank Commander, and which is VC 148. And he had a UKG 90 at auction, and it sold for like 86 US bucks or something really low like that. And I was like, that's about what they go for here. And sure enough, a few days later, this one sold for 80 bucks. So just that shows you the good deal that guy had in that auction. And then speaking of some of the other Haslabs, we had the 4-pack from the Ghost Haslab, Ezra Bridger, Arasandula, Kanan, and Zeb. And so for all 4 of those in star cases, those 4 sold for $350, which is less than $100 a piece. Not a terrible deal there. And then we had the 2 Tonica sisters. These 2 together sold for $290. Although I think you can actually get them at this point. You can probably get them cheaper now. I saw either one of these have been selling this week in the $130 to $135 range. I found a number of sales individually for those 2. So that puts you at $260 to $270-ish. These sold for $290, so I think you can probably do a little better than $290 now for both of them together. But if you just want to knock them out, then I get it. That's no harm there. And it was also free shipping on this one. And then for all of the Cantina figures, Cantina pack-ins, this seller had them all available, all 5, for $425. The best offer accepted on these 5 was $400 plus $7 shipping. So $407 for just the mint on cards from the Haslab Cantina. And then speaking of other Haslabs, I've got a couple of data points for the Yak Face, including a graded one that was interesting. But for the ungraded Yak Face, now I want to go to the coin here for a second, and we'll come back to that when we get to the graded example that sold, because I've got a question for those of you that know more than I do. But this is one of the mint on cards from Haslabs that you got to be careful on, right? We've seen ones with kind of half circle or semicircle indentations on the card. The other big problem that we obviously know about is that a lot of these were not glued, the blisters were not glued to the card back properly, so they fall off. And you can kind of see that here, right? If you look at the seal on this one, it's not great. Like the left-hand side it's got a lot of air bubbles inside that seal. So that's just something that you want to make sure you're careful of. And you can even see it here. At least he's kind enough to point it out, right? That it's starting to peel off a little bit from the card. So he sold it for $150, which is very fair given that this one is basically on its, I mean, over here, this is a good shot right here that really shows the issue. You know, obviously the seal is not great at the top by the coin, but on the left-hand side, it's really bad. It's really bad. It's already starting to peel off. You can even see some light litho tears there going on. So this one is not going to probably stay together very long, given how poor that seal is. And that's something that you just want to be aware of. I'm sure that most of you knew this stuff already, but I'm just trying to share that for those that are maybe not experts on the vintage collection. So that one sold for $150, given the issues. This one sold for $184.06 at auction. And, you know, who knows if the seal is as good. It looks better just on the limited photos, but obviously in certain lighting, you can hide the fact that the seal is not great. I'm not saying that this seller did that because they probably don't even know about it. This seller is really focused on vintage Kenner stuff from what I've seen. They've sold a lot of vintage Kenner, really nice items. So I just think that they maybe are not aware of the seal issue. But I think if I'm selling one of these, I would make sure to highlight, if it's got a good seal especially, I would make sure to highlight that and say, hey, seal's fine, no indentation on the card by the logo. This one looked really good, and so obviously it sold for more at $184. Now, I want to get to the coin, all right? So this one was an AFA 9.25 for the Haslab Yak Face, and they noted on the label, and I think we've talked about this in another graded, in another video about a graded example that sold, but AFA does denote whether it's the shiny or kind of the flat coin. And this one was the shiny coin, and it was a 9.25. Obviously, that's a very high grade. Now, it was listed, and it says sold at $800. I was like, what? $800 seems like way too high. But even, I looked it up on 130point.com, and it sold for $650, which is still a big number relative to, where it's selling ungraded. Now, I'm not saying that these are equal, right? It's really tough to get a 9.25 at all. But this, it's, let's call it between $150 and $200 for an ungraded example. And this one sold for $650. And then going back to the coin, I'm assuming that this one is also the shiny coin. Just looking at it, it looks like the shiny coin to me. And this one, to me, also looks like the shiny coin. I mean, it's got a shiny effect to it. So I'm assuming that those are the same type of coin just based on what this one looks like that's graded shiny versus those other two. But another question for you guys, for those of you that are experts on this stuff, I'm not, is the matte or the flat finish coin considered more rare, or are they about equal? Just something you could comment on if you should choose to do so. But I thought that was an interesting sale at $650. That's a big number. Next up, the Lost line. This was the entire Lost line along with the obviously the Jar Jar Binks in carbonite, and so you can see that here. Pretty clean example overall. I didn't really see much wrong with it, but it looked pretty clean for the Jar Jar Binks. And so that one was originally listed, I think, at $600 in an auction. No one bid, so they relisted it at, I think, $500, and it did end up selling on 3 bids at $550 for the entire Lost Line set from SDCC 2012. So $550 on that. And then we had one other graded item I wanted to show you before we talk about that prototype. This is an uncirculated 90 grade Antoc Merrick from South Beach Toys, trusted seller in front of the channel. Card 90, blister 95, figure 95, but it's got that uncirculated designation, which is a little tougher to get, obviously, because you got to send in the entire Target exclusive Rogue One X-Wing and get just the card graded and then get it shipped back. So that's a lot of expense just shipping that X-Wing to and from, plus the the grading. So $175 on that feels pretty fair to me, just given that an ungraded Antoc still goes routinely for $80 to $85 right now. So $175 felt like a good deal there. And then finally, here is the prototype. Now, I do not know much about this item and in terms of how they know this is a prototype. And they have a video here that shows it, and I don't know. I'm assuming that they either had some documentation supporting that this was a prototype, or there is a date stamp that is on the retail release version of this particular item. Obviously, it's in the it's in the mint on card that we just talked about in that SDCC box set, but CAS graded it first shot prototype Jar Jar Binks SDCC exclusive 90 plus grade, and it sold for a huge number, $1,075.50. And again, I'm just going on assumption here. If they didn't have any data to support it, I'm assuming that they had to have known that that the retail version does have a date stamp on it somewhere on that carbonite block. But, you know, also if you have some provenance with it, you can have like a letter written and signed by a Hasbro employee or a Hasbro engineer. There's all kinds of ways to get these authenticated, but I just thought that this was an interesting item since I had never personally, I don't ever remember seeing a loose graded vintage collection prototype come up for sale on eBay. I know that Boss Bounty Tim, he's got a unpainted first shot prototype Dengar that is loose graded by UKG. I'm sure you guys remember that when he aired that one, but that was a really cool item, I thought, especially because it's VCO1, which is the very first figure. I mean, to have a first shot prototype for the very first figure ever made or released by Hasbro, that's pretty cool. But I would say this is a pretty cool item too, though, you know, given that the Jar Jar Binks in Carbonite is kind of funny, and it's kind of, you know, this is what makes this even funnier is you got Jar Jar Binks in Carbonite, and the Carbonite block is also in acrylic Carbonite. So he's got double Carbonite going on this one. So I just thought this was a pretty cool item, and congrats whoever got that. But yeah, big number, $1,075.50 for that. And that is all I've got for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back soon.